Our lesson this morning will have within it some concepts that have been brought over from our Bible class, though we didn't call attention to this particular situation while we were in Bible class, we do now. Here we have in the book of Philemon, which was in our Bible class, we have a master. His name is Philemon. We have his servant. His name is Onesimus. The Apostle Paul did not write to the church, to Philemon and tell him to set his servant, his slave, free. That's an interesting point in consideration of what goes on in the world as the world, looks at what ought to be done. What we want to do is look at a number of things that God has allowed. There are some things that God would call sin one day, and later it would not be sin. He would allow it, he would regulate it, and by regulating it, he authorized it. And one of the things would be slavery. But let me set the principles up for you by looking at 1 Kings chapter 8. 1 Kings chapter 8. As you're turning, we call to mind King Midas. King Midas was a fellow that the story's told who wanted to be rich and he was greedy. And so he would make the request, I wish for everything I touch to turn to gold. He did not intend for the food he touched to turn to gold. He did not intend for his precious daughter that he touched to turn to gold. Sometimes when we make a request, we fail to understand the terrible unintended consequences of our desires, our wants. And so what we're going to do, we're going to look at those particular thoughts that some people have wanted through the centuries, but God did not want, but yet he regulated them. One of them is slavery. Another, however, starts in 1 Kings chapter 8 concerning a king. Israel wanted a king. When God gave Israel a king, he clearly warned them that it would not be good for them. He knew that granting them what they wanted would produce unhappiness in the nation. Read with me in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 1. Remember, God had judges before he had Saul, king of Israel, the first king. It came to pass when Samuel was old, and he made his sons judges over Israel, and his sons took bribes and perverted justice. Verse 3. Verse 4. Then all the elders of Israel gathered to Samuel, and he said in verse 5, make us a king to judge us like all the nations round about. That's a great lesson in itself. Let us be like the nations round about. You don't want that. You don't want that. But we look at verse 6. The saying displeased Samuel. And he went to Jehovah and he spake. And Jehovah spoke unto him and said, hearken unto the voice of the people and all that they say unto thee. They have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not be king over them. I don't know whether Israel fully understood that or not, but that's the case. Unintended, terrible consequences. Verse 9. Now therefore hearken unto their voice, howbeit thou shalt protest solemnly unto them. Thou shalt show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. Samuel told all the words of Jehovah unto the people who had asked for a king. So you hear the warning, don't you? Protest seriously, soberly, solemnly. They're going to be sorry that they had a king. Verse 11. So Samuel told them. I'm skipping some, but you'll see the point. This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you, said Samuel to the children of Israel. He will take your sons and appoint them for his chariots, and he will make them instruments of war. Verse 13. He will make your daughters, or take your daughters. Verse 14. He will take your fields and give them unto his servants. He will take the tenth of your seed. He will take your men servants and your maid servants and put them to work in his work. He will take the tenth of your flocks, and ye shall be his servants. Let me stop just for a moment. Do you see that same thing happening in America with socialism? You do. We have is it Generation Z? I always forget which one it is, X, Y, Z, or ABC. But they want socialism in the American government, and they clamor to those who are in power, give us, give us, give us. Well, what will you give us in exchange? Well, we will give you our freedom. They don't realize that's what they're saying, but that's what's going on. Whenever you have government, overabundance of government, you're going to give up your freedoms. You could see some of that going on during the pandemic, giving up freedoms. Well, that's what the Lord is saying to the children of Israel. He will make them his servants instead of yours. Not only that, but as I mentioned in verse 17, he will take the tenth of your flocks, and ye shall be his slaves, his servants. Verse 18, ye shall cry out in that day because of your king whom you shall have chosen, and Jehovah will not answer you in that day. But the people refused to hearken unto the voice of Samuel, and they said, nay, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations round about us. Verse 22, and Jehovah said, hearken unto their voice, make them a king. What a perfect illustration of how God's system, his law, his plan, the way that he has put forth works. And then when we replace it, it don't work as well. And God knew that all along. God knew that he being king was a much better situation than for them to appoint a human king over that nation. That's what he tried to warn them about. God does not make laws simply to be mean and restrict man's freedom. The natural consequences of Israel's foolish choice was to live under a faulty human king versus the freedom of divine rule. Israel paid a steep price for her rejection of God. So we put aside the idea of king, and we have seen a number of great principles. We turn our attention to slavery. This is the reason we're looking at this lesson, though we've looked at them time and time again. And that's because when we read Philemon, when we read Colossians, when we read Ephesians, we saw that God would regulate being a master. He would regulate being a servant, a slave. Well, wait a minute. Slavery is horrible. Slavery is no good. Slavery is terrible. You need to be against it. You need to be against the God that's for it. Let's learn some things. God doesn't necessarily want slavery, but he allowed it. But when he allowed it, he also made sure that there were no abuses of it. Looking at a number of passages, for instance, Leviticus chapter 25, verse 52, we need to read this and hear it personally with our own ears and really read the whole context. Verse 52, and if there remain but few years unto the year of Jubilee, then he shall reckon with him, the master and the slave, according to his years shall he give back the price of his redemption. What? I read that so you could see what was going on. Now we give you the summary. In the year of Jubilee, God would say, all slaves are free. All slaves are free. They go back to the land that was assigned them when they went into the land of promise. That family that had sold their soul unto a master was set free. Does that sound like any kind of slavery that you hear of in America, in China, on the border? We take notice in verse 53. As a servant hired year by year shall be with him, he shall not rule with rigor over him in my sight. The word rigor is cruelty, severity, harshness. What a difference that makes in slavery and master. It's as if God is saying, look, you don't have master slave, though those words are used. What you have is employee. And even with an employer and an employee, you can still have rigor, cruelty, harshness, meanness by those who are your boss. So whether you call it slavery or you call it employment, here's what God said about it. Don't practice rigor. Don't be rigorous in your mastery of somebody else. Now, you have rule over a human being. You're going to have rule over that human being for a temporary period of time. But whenever you have rule, you treat him right. I'm now looking at Exodus 21:20. The subject of the context includes the idea of manslaughter, but we're going to leave that part out and just hone in on the verse 20. If a man smite his servant or his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall surely be punished. He will be punished with death. He will be punished with death. You take, as a master, the life of your servant, you're going to die as well if he died by your hand. Compare that with slavery in America in the 19th century, 18th century. Compare that with the slavery of Africa, Africans against Africans. By the way, when God said this to Israel, God is saying not only whenever you have a fellow Israelite doing this, you've got to treat other people with humanity. The cruelty of humanity against humanity is noted. It's well known. It's not something that's here and there and every once in a while, but men can be mean to men, and God knew it. And he said, don't do it. And if you think you have the right to take a slave or a captive and take his life because you're boss hog, you ain't. You ain't. Turning to the New Testament, Ephesians 6:9, we read the last couple of weeks. Ye masters, do the same things unto them, and forbear threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven. Masters, you have a master. Boy, that'll sober you up. And there is no respect of persons with your master in heaven. Whenever he sees you as a master and he sees him as a servant, you ain't over him. You're both human beings. Looking at Colossians 4:1, masters, render unto your servants that which is just and equal. Be fair and righteous toward them. Now, whenever you contrast the slavery of the world, and I would call your attention to the border, our United States border. Right now, and I'm not talking politically, I'm talking about what's going on in the area of slavery. There are the Mexican cartel that they are steeped in sin and transgression against God and against humanity. They will charge you $35,000 to take you to the border of the United States so that you can come into America. Well, once you get into America, you're all free and ready to go. No, you're not. You are indebted to them, and they will take your life, and they will take the life of your family, and they will take your freedom when you are their slave. That slavery is condemned by God. That slavery is forbidden by God. God has never allowed such slavery as that. Whenever you look at the Uyghurs, the what? The Uyghurs in China. The Uyghurs in China are under tremendous, tremendous affliction. Now, whether you agree with the religion or not is not the case. There is not, gives no matter. The fact is they are human beings, and they ought not to be mistreated as they are. But in China, you can get an iPhone cheaper than you can in America. So we're going to be sure, and we're going to support China as they fix our iPhones and give us new iPhones. Enes Kanter, who is a 7-foot center forward in the National Basketball Association was removed from playing basketball because he spoke up against China. And LeBron James spoke up against America for China. And Enos made sure that people understood the distinction. They kicked him out and they elevated LeBron James. Something's wrong with that theory. Something's wrong with those actions. Whenever you have the Uyghurs in China making penance, no money at all for what they've done. It's good to know that the Apple has decided to quit dealing with China and start dealing with India. That's a step in the right direction. But at the same time, why doesn't the NBA condemn China as much as they condemn America? Politics. With the border and with China and with Rome and with some in America, there were no safeguards. With God, there were safeguards. And you can see them in Leviticus, Exodus, Ephesians, and Colossians. We turn our attention from slavery and from give us a king to God allowing divorce. As you look at the Bible, you take notice in Genesis chapter 2, verse 22 through 23, that God caused a deep sleep to come upon Adam. He took his rib and he made a woman, and he said, "This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman. Therefore shall the man leave father and mother, cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." We take notice that Jesus quoted that passage in Matthew 19, or referenced it in chapter 19, whenever the Jews were bringing up God's law of divorce in the Old Testament. He said, "Have you not read in the beginning? One man for one woman for one wife." That's God's plan. Now, let me tell you, I mentioned to you there are certain things that God has given that is best for man. And one man for one woman for one life works real well, except for Sue. We take notice also in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 2, "But because of fornications," plural, "let each man have his own wife," that's singular, "and let each woman have her own husband," that's singular. So God's plan, again, is one-on-one. Jesus makes reference to it to prove that divorce is not right. Malachi even tells us in Malachi 2:16, God hates divorce. Wait a minute, God hates divorce, yet he allowed it? Yep. That's strange. God hated for Israel to have a king, but he allowed it. There are things that he will allow in his wisdom, and when he allows it, he regulates it, and when he regulates it, it's authorized by God. Moses, they would ask, why then did Moses, the Jews, before Jesus, say that you were to give a writing of divorcement? And Jesus said, because of the hardness of your heart. So divorce and the writing of a bill of divorcement was authorized, regulated divorce. Thus we see that God has indeed regulated. By the way, in Deuteronomy chapter 24, you do see a bill of divorcement, and you do see regulation. Whenever the wife is put away for an unseemly thing, for an unclean thing, whatever that is, big discussion in the first century, and she goes out and marries another, she has not sinned. But whenever she leaves that husband and tries to go back to the first husband, God says, you ain't going to do that. We're not doing that in the Old Testament. Stop just a moment. It's vitally important that we understand there's a difference in the Old Testament law and the New Testament law. The New Testament law says one man for one woman, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Matthew chapter 19. However, God allowed divorce in the Old Testament. We turn our attention from the idea of divorce to polygamy and concubines. How many combines How many combines did Solomon have? Well, he didn't have any, but he had 700 concubines. And he had about 300 wives. Folks, that boggles my mind. I don't care what. But the what is this. We're talking about a political partnership in the day of King Solomon. But when it comes to God's original plan, Genesis 2:22-23, what did we read? A man shall leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife, the two shall become one flesh. That's also true when it comes to polygamy. Jesus even verified it, Matthew 19. However, Lamech, 900 years later, introduced polygamy. Genesis 4:19. Lamech took unto him 2 wives. Wait a minute, Ron. 2 wives is certainly less than 300. So Lamech committed less sin than Solomon. Solomon committed no sin. David committed no sin with his wives, many wives. Jacob committed no sins. Abraham, concubine and wife. Why? Because God allowed it. And when God allowed it, he regulated it. I'm going to read a regulation found in Leviticus 18:18. Neither shalt thou take a wife to her sister. Okay, you marry a young lady, and then you take the sister. Whoa. To vex her, to uncover her nakedness beside the other in her life. It is vexing. And you know that it hurts both women whenever you have taken sisters as wife. So he regulated it, but he allowed it as long as they were not sisters. Thus, polygamy was a concession which God regulated for the benefit of the woman. God never wanted either one. So we see polygamy, we see divorce, we see slavery, and we also take note of the king that God would give the children of Israel. Now, we could add 2 more, and we have in times past concerning the temple. So we are back to our main point, and that is God will allow, and God allowed slavery in the first century, but he regulated it to make sure that they were not treated inhumanely, and they were taken care of and fed. If you couldn't feed a slave, you couldn't have a slave. So the Bible gives us a great deal of instruction concerning things that God would allow, regulate, authorize, and then change on in a manner of.